Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Shovik. Today is day 4 of our Grokking MBA application series. Today is going to be more of a workshop than a conversation. So in our earlier videos, I chatted with Maria to craft my resume, to figure out my goals, to start the foundations of what my essays would look like. So today is more about just me writing, me showing you guys some of the key ingredients of what I would say makes a successful leadership essay. And then we will jump into two specific examples of how I wrote two specific leadership essays. So for today's purposes, we're going to do mostly screen sharing. So because I want this video to focus on the content of the essays. But before we jump into that, I want to start by thinking through the 4, but optionally 5 ingredients that make a strong leadership essay. Okay. By the way, I'll also be taking questions on the side. So if you have questions on essays or the content that we are going to review today, please feel free to post a question on the comment, and I'd be sure to get to them. So generally, lots of different essay structures for specific essays. A lot of folks would follow an essay structure like STAR, where you have the situation, task, action, results format. So when I was in business school, we were trying to see what format works for us. This was mostly for interviewing purposes, where I think the way you structure your interview is actually really similar to the way you should structure your essays. So the format that I like to follow is H. Carl. Well, it doesn't really sound as simple as STAR, but hear me out and bear with me. The first part of your essay that, that I like to start with is a key headline. So a headline is a one sentence, max two, summary of what you are about to say. So this is your scope to establish the stakes. This is your scope to really set the direction and tone of your essay. This is the space where I talk very briefly about the accomplishment, or very briefly about the risk that I took, or talking through how high the stakes were. Because more often than not, your admission reader would really not have any context or any background in your own experiences. So it's good to give them a quick heads up on what you're about to say. Then I backtrack and start talking through context. So after I have given them a brief heads up of what my accomplishment is, so for example, a, a headline could be, let's say you're writing an essay where the prompt is, tell us about an example, or tell us about something at work that you're really proud of, right? So if that's the essay question, I would often use my headline as directly answering the question first, where I could say, of all my experiences in leading large schools in India, I'm most proud of transforming an underserved school in Delhi with technology. So that's kind of like my headline statement. You can refine it even further. You can maybe add some scope of the school, but overall, that's a summary statement of your accomplishment, right? So that's your headline. So then, when you move to context, you immediately go back a little bit to start off with, this school had like these many students, and when I first started working with the school leader, or when I first started working with the staff, I realized that the school was horribly under resourced, for example, or maybe student attendance was uh, dwindling every single year, or you just give them a little bit more as to which problem you were specifically solving, right? This is more about qualifying the problem, talking through the extent of the problem, okay? And then after setting up that context, you move to action. This is where you talk about how you swooped in as a superhero and what you actually did. Um, Often, and I've made this mistake in the past, by the way, I was a reapplicant to most of my schools, right? So in my first year of application, which was way back in 2016, well, I was too young, and I just really did not know how to craft and articulate my accomplishments, and I got rejected everywhere. And I think one of the reason that my essays were so terrible was because my action was all me telling them what I did rather than me showing them what I did. So I would often have statements like, I convinced 90% of the teachers to use technology that helps students learn and also keep them engaged. Now, that sentence overall is fine, but it tells them what I did. But, anybody could say that, right? So my learning was more around how I can convince my reader or how I can show my reader what I did rather than telling them what I did. So you'll see a lot of that when I walk you through some of the examples for today. So action is more about how you persuaded someone, how you got buy-in from other stakeholders who weren't necessarily on board with your plan. Action could also be actual groundwork. I was just reviewing someone's application who was involved in a congressional campaign in New York, and a lot of her action was convincing minority voters to come out and vote, going door to door. So that also really good action stuff to talk about. And then the fourth thing that, again, like the last thing that you need here is to talk through some of the results, some of the impact that you have been able to create. So this one could be an improvement in the top line or the bottom line. Maybe you can talk about your efforts directly led to increase in revenue or increase in profitability. Or this could also be a qualitative improvement in your team, or this could be getting a contract, like whatever your articulated, like whatever your essay was supposed to be about. This is qualifying how big of an impact you were able to make. And then finally, this is optional but not really. You want to walk through a bit of what you learned through this experience. Generally, an experience like this would be fairly transformative, right? Like you would probably come out of the door as a result of this experience, a slightly different person. So, as a result of that, you want to talk through some of the major learnings that you have. And this is especially valuable for a failure essay where you are talking about a time where your efforts did not work, or somebody did not believe in you, or you tried your best but you did not get the impact that you needed. The key highlight for essays like those is self-reflection and showing self-awareness, where you are able to pinpoint what exactly went wrong and how you are and how you are a different and better person as a result of that experience. Okay. And so learning is super compelling way to show maturity, how you've grown as a person, and how you have higher EQ. But learning is truly mandatory for failure essays. A failure essay without learning is absolutely incomplete. Okay, cool. So that's what I generally recommend as an overall structure for the essay. I would start off, again, just quickly recapping. I would start off with the headline. I would move to, I'd walk back and give my reader some context. And then I would talk through what I specifically did, my actions. Then I would qualify the impact with results and numbers. And then finally, I would talk through my key learning as a result of the project. Okay, cool. So now that we have that structure in mind, let's move to an essay that I actually wrote. So um, because this is a video, and the doc link is already there in the description and in the comments, so you can go read the fine print after the video. But what I want to do on this one is actually walk you through how I was able to follow that structure. Okay, so the first one is, it's a leadership experience, so that structure is key here. So the essay question is, describe a leadership experience and how you made a positive and lasting impact. And then responses can draw from professional or personal experience. Through your response, the admissions committee hopes to gain an insight into your achievements, involvement, and leadership footprint. So I had a lot of different things to talk about here, but I really wanted to focus on the word lasting. The reason is that I think I wanted to talk about the specific leadership based accomplishment where I felt I was able to bring about the change that was going to be more enduring than my other accomplishments, right? So I'll first walk you through what this experience was. So don't start reading the essay just yet. So in India, one of the very common thing in schools and also out of schools is this concept of private tuition. So these can be super expensive. So often students in middle and high school, after spending 6-7 hours of school, they often go to these this private classes where they can learn how the same stuff that they're supposed to learn in school, but allegedly with better teachers. And they pay a lot of money. So I was teaching in this school as a part of Teach for India. I was teaching in this super underserved school where I was directly responsible for one middle school class and one high school class, and I was teaching them math and writing and science too. Me and my team in Teach for India, my other co-teachers were teaching them reading and social studies. So basically, Teach for India teachers were in charge of that entire class. And it was a very common thing in the school for them to go for school-sponsored tuition classes, which would mean the same teachers that were there in the school would take tuition classes, and they would have to pay a pretty hefty sum of additional money to enroll in that school. Generally, the practice was close to 90 to 95% of the students would actually also sign up for the school tuition. So this kind of like creating an extra revenue stream for the school. But we didn't have that because as a part of Teach for India curriculum, like we were already teaching them to the extent that we could, to using different techniques, and we were seeing some really good learning outcomes. So we didn't really believe that the students needed to go for an additional tuition classes. The other thing was, the students were already like really poor. Like my students literally had no money. So adding a new set of classes that cost a lot of money would add a lot of financial strain for my students. However, because this was a revenue opportunity for the school, there was a lot of incentive for the school to get the students in these classes. So I had to make a choice on whether I wanted to get my students to these classes or whether I want to stick to my guns and take or put my foot down and say no. So I wanted to establish those stakes at the beginning of the essay, right? And then when I decided I wanted to say no, my school leader was very combative, and in his perspective, he's losing out on like 50% of the school revenue for the two classes, which was a lot of money, and it was not a very pleasant exchange. So I wanted to talk through that example. So let me walk you through how I framed my essay for this specific leadership experience. So if you read so I'm gonna give you guys 1 minute to 30 seconds to actually read through the first and second paragraph, and then we'll be back real quick to discuss how this adheres to the structure I just talked about. Okay. So you don't have to pause. It's a live video. So we'll just take 30 seconds real quick, and then we will jump to a quick analysis there. All right. So the first paragraph, so the first paragraph was more about my headline and context, right? So I would admit this essay does not have an ideal headline, right? The reason, so I could add a headline here where I talk, where I could say, I made the most positive and lasting impact when I went against my school leader's wishes to extract extra revenue from my students, but instead created a community center where they could learn at their own pace. So instead of a headline like this, I chose to directly jump into context, but establish the stakes of this challenge nonetheless, because I wanted a more a shocking entry to the essay. So I did not want to spoil my reader on what I specifically did. So I had a brief headline, and then I immediately jumped into context. So I started off with, like my first day in my second year as a Teach for India teacher, my school leader asked me to convince the parents of my low income students to join an expensive after school program run by the school management to increase revenues. So, by the way, most of my admission readers were American, right? So they needed that extra bit of context, like what is this private tuition thing? That's not a thing in India. That's not a thing in the US. Sorry. So I had to give them just a little bit on what this is aimed at. And then I also wanted to establish the stakes. I think this is super important because for most American readers, this could be like, okay, so that's good for the students, right? Like if it's an after school program, so what's the big deal here? So then I also wanted to qualify that by saying, when I refused, I was given an ultimatum: get my students to enroll, or TFI fellows would be removed from my class from the following. And this actually happened. So my school leader said that if I'm not able to get my students to that tuition center, which cost my students a lot of money and most of their parents a lot of money, they're just not going to let TFI teachers teach my class the next year. So TFI had already been teaching this class for the last 5 years, and as a result of that, we had been able to build a really strong relationships with the parents of my students. And as a result of building that strong relationship, and also the fact that most of these parents used to be were daily wage earners, right? So they were not like, they didn't have sophisticated blue collar or white collar jobs. They were literally had daily jobs, or a lot of them were also unemployed. But so they had a lot of trust on us. So for them, we could practically tell them anything, and they would agree, because they had this underlying belief that we had their students, their children's back. So we knew what was best for their students. So it was very hard for us, for me and my co-teachers, to kind of exploit that belief and that trust to ask them to join this after-school program. But at the same time, because future TFI teachers in that school um, was indeed a risk, we had to make sure that we create some sort of a structure to make sure my students continue to learn even after we have left. So then I start talking about the dilemma for this decision. So in my next paragraph, I start talking about consulting with my other TFI co-teachers, and from the TFI perspective, this was a really high functioning classroom. So I needed to get their buy-in on an alternative plan, where my students would continue to learn and grow and not have to join this really really expensive after school program. So this entire paragraph is my headline and my context, where I talk about why this situation was important and what I specifically did, to create like a basic plan of action going forward. So now let me give you guys 30 more seconds to read the final paragraph, and then we'll come back to talk through some of the results and some of the learning. All right, so in the last paragraph is all about my actions and the key results. So I talked about building a community center and how I built it. I didn't just say I built a community center, right? So I talked about leveraging my other teachers to spread the word, creating a fundraising plan, and also what the library contained. And then I finally talked about my results. So I talked about how that center helped graduation rates and distinction rates, and then the next step. So as you can see here, there is not an explicit learning out there. So and that's okay, because a very successful leadership example does not really need learning, because you don't often learn from your successes. Maybe sometime, maybe it's like a if it's like a long drawn process with like failures in between. But generally, learning comes from failure. If this essay gave me a slightly higher word count, I would talk through a little bit more details for my actions, and I would maybe spend a sentence or two on the learning. Because my word count was severely limited on this one, I chose to focus on giving my reader a bit more context on this and raising the stakes, and then talk about some of the actions and results. Um, Also, case in point on this one, this essay could also be like, tell us about a time where you changed something, or tell us about a time where you stood up for your value, or things like that. Like, for example, when I was thinking about my Stanford or my Yale essay, the Stanford essay being what matters most to you and why, and the Yale essay being, what is the biggest commitment that you have made. I often talk about challenging the status quo, or um, you know innovation, and like doing things that are traditionally considered radical or not very similar. So those are some of the things that I feel more connected to. I feel more passionate about. So this could also serve a strong example for those essays. So think about your essays as stories that you can use for multiple applications. You will not have to have a one unique story for every single essay that you write. Okay, cool. So now let's move to Michigan prompt. So Michigan is famous for these short answer type questions. So they have to be limited to 100 words. So that's super difficult. But those ideas still remain in place. Within those 100 words, unfortunately, you still have to talk about your headline, action, context, result, all of those things. So let's take 30 seconds again. Let's just read through them. This is a very short example, and I'll circle back after 30 seconds. All right. So for this one, I wanted to use an example from ISLI. ISLI was a startup, was a school leadership startup where I worked right after my stint as a teacher in Teach for India. I was working directly with school leaders, and it was also an opportunity for me to scale up my experience. So rather than just working on one specific class, I was able to work on 50 or even 100 schools all across India. So one of the big challenges that we had over there at ISLI was to really think about what is the how do we really track the success of our program. So our program was all about helping school leaders improve their leadership, improving teacher efficiency, improving student learning outcomes. But I felt just measuring those two things, or just measuring learning outcomes, is not really the exact way where we contribute. We did a lot of other stuff with school leaders where we increase their skills, where we help school leaders track their school management and learning management system. So all of those things do not necessarily directly impact student learning. So I had built a framework that could more accurately use over 70 indicators that track a school's success, and then measure the school's performance based on those indicators, as opposed to just saying that our program helps students improve their grade levels by XX% or whatever, right? So that's the idea that I was going for. As you can see, the first sentence here is just the headline and the context, right? So I was trying to establish stakes. I was trying to establish what the example is going to be about. And then my entire second and third sentence is all about my action. So I talked about turning this idea into action by designing this framework. I brought in other variables. And again, remember, this was a severely short essay. 100 words does not do this example justice, but you still have to play by the rules. So I couldn't talk about how I consulted experts. I couldn't talk about how I surveyed 50 schools by physically traveling and spending hours interviewing them. So I just couldn't talk about those things because of the word count, and I had to immediately jump to results. So I talked about how these indicators, was a more accurate measure of our program success, and how we were able to get new investors as a result of those metrics. So even for a small 100-word essays like this, I would strongly recommend using the same H. Carl structure to keep yourself in check. So those are the two things that I want to talk about. So I will also add essays for some other schools that I'm working for application for this mock application series. And I also wanted to quickly add a note on my recommendations. So recommendations are pretty much the same for most schools. The biggest change they would have is like maybe slightly different word count. So it's mostly going to be around explain the relationship with this candidate, tell us about their leadership. And then there would be an additional question on, tell us about a time when you gave this candidate a critical feedback and how did they respond and things like that. Okay. So what I would do is I would also paste two recommendation responses that I got from my erstwhile MBA application recommender. I'd put that in the Google Doc before our next video, where you would be able to see what a good recommendation note looks like when you are trying to give your recommender pointers on how to draft, which examples to use. You can use that as a guide for your recommendation. All right, okay, cool. So thanks for joining us today. I wanted to show you two specific essay examples where I followed a structure, followed a framework. Our next video is in the new year, so spend some time with the holidays and just don't work too hard on those applications. In the last video, I'll come back with Maria again, where we would go through an entire application. So we'll talk about some sanity check strategies and some recommendation strategy before we then move to the next part of this series where we do some mock interviewing. All right, so I'm getting one question. I'll take that real quick, although we are a little bit out of time. So this question comes from Lux. Shovik, are those experiences needed to be professional related, or can they also be personal or community based? That's a great question. So I would say if it's mentioned somewhere, so as you can see for this essay, they explicitly say that they could be personal, they could be, personal or professional. So in this one, you could go either way. I would say if it's not mentioned explicitly, try to take a work-related example. There would be some essays where it's very clear that you can add a personal example. The other thing that I would add here is sometimes schools would have multiple essays, right? So let's say a school has 3 essays, and for 2 of them you have talked about a work story. Then one essay could very easily be a personal story. Especially for schools like Michigan or Berkeley, they would explicitly give you opportunities to talk about personal leadership challenges. This could be when you mentored someone. This could be you overcoming a key obstacle from your life. So this could be within any personal direction. You don't have to restrict yourself to professional examples. However, generally we tend to have more leadership experiences at work. It's also more stakes. It's also where you are interacting with people that are different from you. So work examples tend to do well for the vast majority of the cases. All right, okay, cool. Thanks for joining, you guys. I'll see you guys all next week, but I again come back with Maria so to walk through some of my application materials, and we'd also talk about some of the key dates when Maria and I will do some mock interviewing, just like we did, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and that video was super popular. So we wanted to make an update to that video where Maria interviews me and tells me why my answers are terrible. All right, thanks for joining. Have a great new year, and I'll speak to you guys soon.